All right, I'm in the Gospel of John, chapter 18. This is the arrest of Jesus, when Jesus is arrested. In John chapter 18, the Gospel of John chapter 18, verse 1, it says, "When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered." All right, now this was a place, and in verse 2, it says that this is a place that Judas knew of. It was a place that they went to often. And it was after these words, referring to the words that he expressed previously to his disciples and also in his prayer, which I explained in the previous messages. The end of the prayer was just that the disciples and us, that we would be loved by our God, which of course is a big deal. It's very important, and it's a big challenge because there are so many obstacles that we tend to believe in. The beliefs that we have are obstacles that keep us from embracing and resting in the love of God. And that's a struggle that is important for people to have and to go through. It's part of our growth and maturity in the Christian life. All right, now in this message, I'm going to be spending time talking about the historical event of his arrest. That's what I'm going to focus on here because that's what's happening. And there are a lot of things that were taking place that I think is easy to not pay attention to. It's easy to not pay attention to what's happening here, to skip over these verses and not really understand the magnitude of what was happening. And so I'm going to try to show some things about what is taking place here that you may not have ever considered or thought of too much. In verse 2, John chapter 18, verse 2, it says, "And Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. Then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons." All right? So you've got Jesus and his disciples leaving the place where they were enjoying the Passover. This was the evening of the Passover. They leave there and they go over to the garden that they would often go to. Before they left, Jesus exposed Judas as being the person who would betray him. All right? And so, this is what causes Judas to act in the way that he did and at the time that he chose to act. And this was a time when the people, the religious leaders, and of course the Romans and others, were not prepared as they were hoping that they could be prepared. The religious leaders were hoping that they could be better prepared for this arrest, and they were not prepared for this because Judas was exposed before they got themselves organized. Jesus exposed Judas. Now this is found in John chapter 13, and I spent a lot of time talking about John chapter 13. You can go back and review the messages that are there. Just to review this a little bit, though, in John chapter 13, verse 24, it says, "Simon Peter therefore motioned to him to ask who it was of whom he spoke. Then leaning back on Jesus' breast, he said to him, 'Lord, who is it?' Jesus answered, 'It is he to whom I shall give a piece of bread when I have dipped it.' And having dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. Now after the piece of bread, Satan entered him. Then Jesus said to him, 'What you do, do quickly.'" All right, that was the exposure. What you're going to do it, and you better do it. You better do it fast. You better do it soon. All right, this was the exposure of Judas. Judas had already made an agreement with the Sanhedrin, with the religious leaders, for 30 pieces of silver. He made an agreement that he would assist them in capturing, arresting Jesus so that he could be put on trial and hopefully executed. All right, this was the conspiracy between Judas and the religious leaders. Now, I have mentioned his motives, his likely motives that he had. I've mentioned those motives previously. I'll remind you again in this message that it does not appear that Judas was willing to conspire against Jesus and betray him for the purpose of Jesus being executed. It does not appear that that was really his motive in participating in this conspiracy. I personally have the opinion that he was participating in this conspiracy in order to put Jesus into a situation that he would have to respond and wage war against the Romans. Therefore, he would establish the Messianic kingdom there on earth. That he would be asserted as the Messianic king. This is my personal opinion. We don't have enough information to say that absolutely, and I certainly don't have any divine revelation. I don't think that I have any kind of divine revelation concerning that. And so, I just want you to know that this is just a conviction that I personally have. I've mentioned it a few times, and this is the time to mention it as the arrest is taking place. But Jesus exposed Judas clearly. Judas knew that he was exposed, and there was enough said that the disciples could have a conversation with Jesus, and Judas could be exposed to the disciples in a more clear way. When Judas left, and he could assume, it's reasonable to assume, that the disciples and Jesus were going to talk about Judas when Judas was gone. He should be assuming that would be the normal behavior, that there would be this kind of discussion. Well, now that he's out of here, let's talk about him. He's not here anymore. And yes, I just exposed him as being the one who is going to betray me. I told him if he's going to do it, he better do it soon, better do it fast. Or, there could be the situation where Judas would not be able to fulfill what he agreed to with the Sanhedrin, because Jesus could leave. He could get out of there. He could depart. He could escape. And knowing, the patterns of Jesus and the disciples in terms of where they would often go, where they would hang out, hide out, or whatever, Jesus could change the way that they lived and the way that they interacted with other people. And he could change the places that they would spend time at. And so it would be very difficult. Jesus could make it very difficult for Judas to be able to locate him after that, just because he changes where he's going to go. So this is the opportunity that Jesus gives over to Judas. He gives him an opportunity to say, listen, here's your chance. If you're going to do something, you better do it now, implying that if he doesn't act quickly, all right, if he doesn't do that, well, Judas is going to end up just like everybody else, not necessarily knowing where Jesus could be found, And so this was the situation. Now, Jesus had spoken about this evening before, all right, in the Gospel of Matthew, and I would prefer to stay in the Gospel of John and not bounce around to other books, just because I'm doing a verse-by-verse study through the Gospel of John. But in this case, in Matthew chapter 26, we have something that's helpful concerning this, and so I'm going to refer to this. In Matthew chapter 26, should be in verses 1 and 2. Yeah, in verse 2. In verse 2, Jesus said, "You know that after 2 days is the Passover, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified." All right? Now, this is really important, so important that I'll go outside of John in order to refer to it, because Jesus made a public declaration that he was going to be delivered up. He was going to be captured, arrested, and he was going to be crucified on the Passover. A public declaration that, 2 days from now, this is going to happen. It was in effect a prophecy. He prophesied that in 2 days he was going to be executed. That's a prophecy that's going to be fulfilled quickly, only 2 days away. All right? And being a public declaration, well, the religious leaders would know that this is something that he said. So they definitely do not want to arrest him. They do not want him to be crucified on the Passover because, that's exactly what he said would happen. So they don't want to participate in fulfilling this prophecy because they will then give the believers in Jesus another reason to believe in Jesus. All right? And so if they don't arrest him and they don't crucify him on the Passover, then, Jesus is a false prophet. So when Jesus said that, and he said that as publicly as he did, when he did that, he put everyone in a circumstance, in a situation where they are going to participate in one way or another with what would happen on the Passover. If they do arrest him and crucify him, then they participate in the fulfillment of the prophecy. If they refuse to do that, or they decide that they're not going to execute their conspiracy on the Passover, then they are participating in the ministry of Jesus to the extent where they have now found a way to declare Jesus to be a false prophet. Okay, so, it's an opportunity, but there's also great risk. There's a lot that's happening here because of what Jesus did. Now, the day of Passover began at twilight, the evening, when the disciples and Jesus were having the Passover meal. That's when it began. It began in the evening. The days were recognized as being evening and then morning. So the day was a 24-hour period of time between the sun going down and then the sun going down the next day. So during the evening, Jesus is arrested and he has his trials. And then during the next day, he is crucified. That is still considered to be the Passover day. All right, so they had the Passover meal, which was not what we would know as the Seder meal, as the Passover Seder meal. That was not the meal that they were having. As much as I understand a lot of people would like to believe that, and I feel a little awkward in taking that away from people, but I know that when I mention to it, people don't care anyway. So I'm not really taking anything away from them per se, except in the back of their mind, in the back of your mind, you might remember that I told you that was not the meal that Jesus was having with his disciples. No matter how you might want to say that this is what they were doing, it was not what they were doing. It just wasn't. In fact, if you do a comprehensive study on how they behaved, you'll discover that they didn't do it perfectly. They didn't do it perfectly. And so some people have suggested, I think the best work that's ever been done on this, the person who did this, they suggested that the gospel writers just didn't record everything accurately. That's what they suggest. And okay, if you want to believe that, it really isn't going to make a difference. I take a different position. I have a different point of view. That the reason why it wasn't perfect in terms of the description of how the Passover Seder was generally held at that time, the reason why is because it's not the way, they weren't doing that. All right? That's not what they were doing. That was what would happen 24 hours later. That's what would take place in the evening after Jesus was crucified. All right? The Passover meal was simple. You eat roasted lamb, roasted by fire. You have bitter herbs and unleavened bread. That's it. The rest of it was something that happened 24 hours later on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And of course, I could talk about that for a long time, which I'm not going to do right now because I want to stay focused on what's happening here, the arrest of Jesus. All right, but this is some of the historical stuff that's taking place, and I thought it would be important for you to consider that this is what's happening. All right, so Judas has been exposed during a time when they were not wanting to arrest Jesus because of the risk of him being crucified, because it would be the fulfillment of prophecy. And so you will be able to see some disorganization. That it appears that they obviously were not prepared to do this at this time. You'll see this in chapter 18. It's all over the place. And so I'll point these things out as we come to them. All right, now in order for Judas to obtain the detachment of troops, this is what's found in verse 3. In verse 3, then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. In order for him to obtain the detachment of troops, the Roman soldiers, the Roman cohort, in order to get these guys, he's going to have to agree and do three different things. Okay, the first thing he's going to have to do is he's going to have to go to the Roman compound, and he's going to have to make an accusation against Jesus that states that he has violated Roman law. All right, it's going to have to be a violation of Roman law. He's going to have to make an accusation, and it's going to have to be serious. It's going to have to be a big deal. In this case, the most likely accusation would be sedition, to say that Jesus is going to assert himself as the Messianic king, and we're going to have a war. That's the most likely accusation that he would make in order to get his detachment of troops. The second thing he's going to have to do is help them locate Jesus. He's going to have to go with the cohort, the Roman cohort, the troops from the Roman compound. He's going to have to go and show them where Jesus can be found and point him out, and say, that is the man, so that they arrest the right person. He's going to have to help them with that. The third thing he's going to have to do is he's going to have to go before the judge, the Roman leader who's going to make the decision concerning what they're going to do with this guy. And he's going to have to testify against Jesus at his trial. All right? These are the three things that he needs to do. He does the first two, and everything works out, He does the first two. He makes the accusation against Jesus so that he can obtain the cohort of troops, and he shows them where Jesus is at, and he identifies Jesus. This is the guy. But he does not testify at the trial. He doesn't do that. All right? Why didn't he do that? And the only reason why I can think of that Judas would not go and testify at the trial, which he would have to do, was because the situation didn't play out like he had expected. All right? It would have to work out that way. He would have to agree to testify at the trial, but he didn't go. So, the only thing I can think of is because he never intended to go. He never intended to go and testify against Jesus so that he would be executed for sedition or some other crime. All right? He never intended that. He expected something else to take place, and I'm suggesting that he expected that Jesus would resist. He wouldn't let himself be arrested and then executed. He would resist. He probably expected that. And Jesus didn't. So what's he going to do? Well, he disappears, and I'll speak about that later. So he obtains the detachment of troops, and he shows them, he would go to the garden. We don't know if he went to any other places before that. Maybe he went over to where they were having the Passover. Maybe this is the second place or the third place that Judas took all these guys. Now, how many people were there? How many people went to go and arrest Jesus? Well, the Roman cohort, the detachment of troops, would be somewhere between 300 and 600 soldiers. All right. And these guys would be, heavily armed. Okay. They would be heavily armed. They would have their yard-long battle swords, which were heavy enough and designed to crush someone's skull through their helmet with one sweep of the blade. Okay, 300 to 600 guys, at least, to go and do this. Chances are, because they were going to arrest someone who was so popular, because there was the high probability that there would be some resistance, this was not going to be the usual kind of arrest. Chances are they would have the whole 600. They might even have a few more. All right, but let's just go with that. Let's say that there were maybe 500 to 600 heavily armed Roman soldiers. But these were not the only ones who were there. All right, there were representatives from the Sanhedrin. There were chief priests. There was the servant of the high priest, Malchus. I'll refer to him in just a moment. All right, there were a lot of guys. And there were officers. People who would participate and help with the arrest. These are the guys who are like the Roman soldiers. The officers of the chief priests of the Sanhedrin are the guys who are armed as well, and they would perform arrests in order to bring people before the Sanhedrin for crimes that they would have committed against Jewish law, within the boundaries of what the Romans would allow for them to do. And so you've got soldiers from the religious leaders, the Sanhedrin. You've got the Roman soldiers. You've got some chief priests who are there. You've got servants you got a servant of the high priest. And I'm confident that not everyone is described here. And so how many people do you suppose might be here? Well, it could possibly be up to 1,000 people. It's possible, considering that we're talking about, maybe 500 to 600 Roman soldiers, and then maybe 100 or 200 people who are coming from the religious leaders as well. You could see potentially, pretty close to or up to, or maybe even more, I don't know. But, I'm trying to give you an idea of how many people are going to perform this arrest. This is a lot of people. All right. Consider, your local church that you participate in, if you're participating in a church presently. If your congregation of people has got 1,000 people all gathered together at one time, that'll give you an idea about how many people were just going to arrest this guy in the middle of the night. This is at night that this is happening. They're coming out with lanterns, torches, okay, in order to see in the dark, right? Because this is happening at night, which, of course, is a violation of the laws of the Sanhedrin. The laws of the Sanhedrin are very clear that no arrests were to take place at night, because those arrests would be considered to be secret arrests. All right? And so according to the laws of the Sanhedrin, there were to be no secret arrests. All arrests were to be done publicly. And this is not what they're doing. This is they are violating their own laws. Okay, and there's a lot to be said about the violations that were taking place, and I'll point out a lot of these violations as we go along in what John described about these events. There were many violations by the Sanhedrin just in order to do this evil deed, all right, to arrest Jesus and try to find a way to have him executed. They were against Jesus for many reasons. One of the reasons why they were against Jesus was because they claimed that he was in violation of the Mosaic law or the laws of the Sanhedrin. Therefore, he should be punished, and yet they violate their own laws, themselves, when trying to condemn Jesus to death. All right, but this is one of them, is the secret arrest, the arrest that is happening at night, and they are participating in this. So you got all these people, perhaps almost 1,000 people who are showing up, and this might be the second or third place that they went in order to find Jesus. They're showing up, they are approaching Jesus and his disciples. He's got 11 guys? Because, Judas is the 12th and he's not with them at the moment. He's coming, but there are a lot of people who are going to perform this arrest. Let's see what happens afterwards. In verse 4, all right, in John chapter 18, verse 4, Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, "Whom are you seeking?" All right, he knew what was going on. He knew. And instead of making a run for it, 1,000 people will be seen before they arrive. You're gonna hear them. You're gonna see them. They would have an opportunity to make a run for it, but Jesus does not take the opportunity to make a run for it, and the disciples don't either. He just goes right up to them when they get there, and they meet, and he asks them directly, "Who are you looking for?" Whom are you seeking? Effectively, who are you looking for? All right? Confronts them head on with that. Verse 5, they answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. Now when he said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Now, folks, it's easy to just kind of, read past this. When he said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Now, don't just read past that and go to the next verse. I want you to think about that for a minute. All right, you've got 12 guys, Jesus and 11 of his disciples, hanging out in the garden, and you got almost 1,000 people who descend upon the garden. And he just goes right up to them and asks them who you're looking for. And they say, "We're looking for Jesus of Nazareth." And he says, "I am he." And they draw back and they hit the ground. All of them. They hit the ground. That's a lot of people with weapons, shields, big swords. They're all ready to go for battle. And they're out there, and it's at night. Everybody's got things to do. They're probably tired and cranky. They haven't had their coffee yet for the morning. Who knows what? But, these guys are not excited about, necessarily about going out there wandering around looking for somebody. And so they could have a little bit of an attitude thinking, let's just find this guy and get this over with. And, well, there he is. Let's get him. But no, they draw back and they hit the ground because he says, "I am he." Now, I believe that John, or the translation, might have left a few things out. I think we've got a few things that are missing here in terms of him saying this. Okay, if he said this and they all hit the ground, then there must have been some kind of divine experience that took place. Some kind of divine experience. This would qualify for a significant emotional event for all these soldiers, and for the officers and the chief priests. All right, everybody who was there apparently drew back and hit the ground. This was a divine experience and a significant emotional event for all these people. All right. Now we don't know if there was maybe some divine resonance maybe that came out of his voice, and just, shocked them, vibrated their bones, shook the earth maybe. Perhaps there was some lightning and thunder. We don't have that much information. Maybe there was the revelation of angels. Maybe the angels who were present, they exposed themselves in a way that the people could see. We don't know. We don't have that kind of information. But what we do know is that whatever was going on, there was no doubt that this was a divine encounter, that they are having a divine encounter with God. All right? For him to say, I am he, I personally think that he was probably expressing to them, I am he, in the sense that I am the living God. Who are you looking for? We're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. Well, I am the living God. That's who I am. And they hit the ground. To me, that was conveyed in some way that the people there would have understood that. Okay, so he gave them a moment, obviously, to kind of regain their composure. Everybody hits the ground. They draw back and hit the ground. Well, they're going to have to get back up. So, you got to watch these people get back up on their feet. Maybe they hurt their elbows or their knees, possibly a little bit. They're a little bit confused, maybe some disorientation. We got to pick up the torches and the lanterns that may have experienced some disruption because of hitting the ground. And they got to get their weapons together. And when they get themselves all back up on their feet and ready to go, who's going to say something, right? All right. So, who's going to talk first? who's going to make the next move, right? That would have been a big event there. So, Jesus goes ahead, and after they get themselves together, I'm sure, he goes ahead and in verse 7, then he asked them again, whom are you seeking? Or, he just asked them that, right? He just asked them, who are you looking for? And they said, we're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. And he says, I am he. And they hit the ground, right? Okay, then he's going to ask them again, who are you looking for? Now, if you were asked this question again, right, you're going to remember you just asked that question a moment ago, and this is what just happened to me. I drew back, I hit the ground, and you're asking this again? Well, these guys might be a little hesitant in giving the same answer, you would think, right? You would think maybe that they would hesitate and not necessarily want to give the same answer because they might hit the ground again, right? They might hit, and we just did that. We don't need to do that again, right? So there might be some hesitation in terms of answering that question. The response before may have been something like, we are looking for Jesus of Nazareth. Yes, we are. And we're going to get him. Yes, we are. They could have had that kind of an attitude. But now, are they going to have that kind of an attitude? It might be something like, well, we're looking for this guy named Jesus. Obviously, that's not who you are. So maybe you could would you be nice and just kind of point us in the right direction? Or the wrong direction is okay too. Just anywhere so that we don't have to hit the ground again. Can you maybe just tell us where to go next, or where we ought to go, or where you would like us to go? Okay. That's how profound that kind of experience should be. That they wouldn't have such an attitude, about, well, we're looking for Jesus. It would be something like, oh, well, we're looking for this guy. We have to. Would you, we don't want it to be you, obviously. We don't want to deal with that. What are they going to do? Are they going to have a fight? They're all dressed up, ready for battle. Why waste the effort, right? No, they're not going to want to do that. when just by his very words they hit the ground? What kind of a battle is that going to be like, right? No, that is not likely what they're going to be interested in. Hitting the ground would be quite an attitude adjustment for everyone there. So their response, while it's not recorded here, I would suggest their response would be given with a little hesitation, all right, a little bit of hesitation. And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. All right, now it doesn't say that it was the same person who said that earlier. It could have been somebody else, somebody else in the background or on the side. Well, we're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus responds. Jesus answered in verse 8, Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. Okay, to tell them that is who he is, especially in this way a second time, that suggests to me that the first time he may have said, I am he, in the sense that I am the divine presence. The second time, I have told you that I am he. He could say, I am Jesus, who is of the divine presence, but I am definitely the one you are looking for. All right? Now, this is going to be a problem. All right? I'm sure that these guys, after hearing him say, now, listen, I've told you already, I am the one you are looking for. You found him. I'm the one. And these guys would probably be hesitating a little bit to respond to that. Okay, I guess we found the guy that we're looking for, and he's not hiding this fact. What do we do? Is he going to resist? If, he didn't even resist before and we all hit the ground. So what is the resistance going to look like? There would definitely be some hesitation on their part about, well, are we really going to do this? Are we going to do this or not? So he responds, like I said earlier, who's going to talk first? who's going to initiate this? I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way. All right. Now that was very nice of him. That was very loving. All right. So if I'm the one you're looking for, these other guys, let them go their way. I'm the one. Let these guys go. That's an indirect way of saying, I am going to comply. I will allow you to arrest me. But of course, I'd like you to let these other guys go. And you know what happened just a moment ago, so maybe you ought to take my request seriously. All right? You better let these guys go or somebody's going to hit the ground, kind of thing. They could have received that. They could say, oh, yeah, sure, no problem. We'll do that. We'll let these guys go. Let them go their way. Verse 9, that the saying might be fulfilled, which he spoke of those whom you gave me, I have lost none. All right, so it was clear to everybody at this point that Jesus is going to allow himself to be arrested. Let these guys go. We all agree on this? You better. If you don't, we're going to have hit the ground number 2 maybe. And so there is a recognition that Jesus is going to allow himself to be arrested. Well, how could this be? After that divine experience, which would be a significant emotional event, not just for the people who came to arrest him, to see 1,000 people hit the ground, the disciples could be quite encouraged. They were able to see this. They watched this. Hey, look at that. Just by his word, they all hit the ground. We are definitely ready for war. Absolutely. And so Peter, out of some kind of enthusiasm, either because he did not want Jesus to be arrested, or he was still somewhat moved by that miraculous event that just took place. Whatever was going on in his head, he decides to do what I like to refer to as the Jewish Rambo. That's what he does. He goes and he attacks almost 1,000 people, perhaps, with a knife. All right? That's the Jewish Rambo. To go, to go and he's going to obtain victory against impossible odds with his knife, And so he goes and he attacks these people, and this is the initiation of the battle, the initiation of war. How does this go? What does he really do? In verse 10, then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. What kind of Jewish Rambo is this, right? I mean, he goes out and he draws. Now, this sword, this was the word that's used here would be better translated as a long ceremonial knife. Okay, the kind of knife that would be used to sacrifice the Passover lamb. That's the kind of knife that he pulls out. So Peter pulls out this long ceremonial knife, right? I said he went after them with a knife. And he attacks who? He goes after the servant of the high priest. I mean, of all the people that were in front of him, that's who he goes after. He goes after the one person who is definitely, I would think, the one who would be the least likely to offer any resistance at all. Okay. Chances are, if he's armed with anything, it's a pencil, okay? A piece of charcoal or something that he's using to write down things in order to document the event. Maybe he's got a piece of burnt wood, that he pulled out of the fire. I don't know, but that's who he goes after. He goes after the one guy who's least likely to be armed. Chances are he's got no weapon of any kind whatsoever. And he's probably the weakest looking guy there, the servant of the high priest. What does he really do for, with his time? This is who Peter charges after and goes after. I mean, what's he thinking? Right? What kind of a fight is this? Well, I suspect that he might have been thinking that he's going to lead the charge. He's going to lead the charge, and all the other disciples are going to follow in after him, right? He's going to lead the charge, and everybody else is going to follow in after him, and they're going to have to pick their own targets. They're going to have to pick their own people who they're going to fight with. And, Malchus is taken. All right. So they're going to have to go after somebody else who probably has a sword. That's who they're going to have to go after. Do you think that they're going to do that? It does not appear that that's what they did. It appears that they did not follow Peter. As Peter led the charge, he would have looked behind and saw that he was by himself. All right. No, they're not going to go in and go after the guys who are left, those who have weapons. That's not what they're going to do. Peter goes and he does this by himself, and he goes after the guy who's the least likely to resist, and he takes off his right ear. All right, now, come on. Why would he take off his ear? Well, of course, this is a long ceremonial knife, and if he strikes him in the head, the blade doesn't have enough weight, and he definitely does not have enough strength in order to cause significant damage. And so, of course, it's going to ricochet off of his head in some way. And for him to lose an ear, that's reasonable, or part of his ear or something with that kind of weapon and that kind of an attack. Now, if Peter was left-handed, it would of course make sense that he would go for the right side of his opponent's head and strike him in that way. But if Peter was right-handed, there's a higher probability that Peter was right-handed, then if Malchus was facing him, that would be a very weak strike. That would not be a strong strike. Therefore, the damage would, of course, be limited that way as well. But what I suspect is that Malchus turned and ran. That's what I think. I think that Malchus probably turned around. He saw Peter coming after him with this knife, all right, and he turned around to run away, but he couldn't move fast enough, and so Peter, being right-handed, took off his right ear because he was behind him. I think that that's probably what this was looking like. But either way, this is not the initiation of some great battle. That's not how this plays out. Jesus stops the situation and allows himself to be arrested and tells Peter to put his knife away. He heals Malchus's ear. I'll explain that later. And this is important because if he doesn't, well, then Peter's going to be arrested and he's going to be put on trial because he attempted to murder this guy, right? And so Jesus is going to have to do something to save Peter, or Peter's now going to be in a lot of trouble as he did this in front of all these people, almost 1,000 people. There are going to be a few witnesses to what Peter did. So Jesus handles the situation. I'll talk about this more in the next message. I'm going to stop here just because there's so much more to say, and I think that this is a pretty good place to stop. For those of you who are using these messages for your small groups, I could not come up with a question in time. By the time that I presented this message, I couldn't come up with a good question. And so I'd like to just encourage you to speak about an observation, all right? I'd like you to maybe consider, this is an option, to speak about the observation that considering this divine experience and obviously a significant emotional event in these people's lives, I'd like you to consider that and consider the fact that it does not appear that the people who were there were moved in a positive way through this experience. When we see what happens afterwards, it's as if Jesus may not have done anything. And yet this was a divine miracle that they all encountered in their own personal way. How could it be that they would not believe in Jesus? How could it be that they would not follow him, that they would not embrace him as their Messiah? I mean, if you were there, how could that be? And I'm asking you to consider this kind of observation because people haven't changed. People today are the same as the people back then. The only thing that's really changed is technology. That's about it. We have a lot of technological advancements, but in terms of personalities and emotions and how people establish their value system, stuff like that, there really isn't any difference at all. People are the same today as they were back then. And why I mention that is because I want you to consider that there are a lot of people around you, maybe 10 out of 1,000, okay, or 1 out of 100, all right? There are many people around who, even if they were to experience personally some kind of divine miracle that would be obvious to them, something that would be of a significant emotional event, all right, something of that category, that they still would not embrace Jesus. They still wouldn't do it, all right? And that there are people today who you probably know who would react that way, who would relate that way. And I want you to consider those percentages as well, that you probably will recognize that out of 100 people, you might find one, maybe 1 out of 100 who does have a sincere interest in knowing their God, and who would be moved by a miraculous event like that, and who would repent and believe in the living God and the truth that he has revealed. You may find only 1 out of 100 today in the relationships that you have, or in the people who you have access to, or who you may discover. And so I think that this is worth speaking of. and having a conversation about, if you were to consider what I mentioned earlier about the idea of a 1,000-member church. If that was the case, you might find 10 people in the 1,000-member church who really do have a genuine interest in knowing their God and having a personal relationship with him. The rest of them are there for other reasons. This is not unusual. I have observed this myself over the years as I have interacted with a lot of different congregations of people. All right, so I'm going to pause here. Instead of a question, I've got an observation that may facilitate some interesting conversation, and I will continue into the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verse 11 in the next message. Thank you.